The word hit Ellen Blackwell like a slap across the face. "Sit down," Sheriff John Sullivan said, and his voice carried none of the brusque authority she had grown accustomed to over the past 3 months. It carried something else entirely, something raw and unguarded that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand straight up. He stood behind his desk in the dim light of the Redemption jailhouse, his hat in his hands for once, turning the brim over and over between his thick fingers like a man who didn't know what to do with himself. His jaw was tight. His gray eyes, usually so cold and measured, were doing something she had never seen them do before. They were afraid. "I have something I should have said sooner," he said. Ellen's breath caught. She did not sit down. She stood in the doorway with the blazing Arizona afternoon sun cutting a long rectangle of gold across the dusty floorboards between them, and she stared at this man who had made her life in Redemption, Texas, both a salvation and a torment. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. "Then say it," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. John Sullivan opened his mouth, closed it, the muscle in his jaw ticked. Outside on Main Street, a horse clattered past, and somewhere down the block, Hattie Morse was sweeping her porch and singing something low and mournful. The ordinary world continued to turn, and inside the jailhouse, everything Ellen thought she understood about the past 3 months began to crack apart. "Your brother didn't steal that money," John said. "I knew it before I arrested him, and I arrested him anyway." The room tilted. Ellen grabbed the doorframe. 3 months, 92 days. That was how long her brother Daniel had been sitting in a prison cell in San Antonio, while Ellen had sold nearly everything she owned, packed what remained into a single carpetbag, and ridden a stagecoach 300 miles to this sun-scorched little town of Redemption to fight for his freedom. 92 days of knocking on the sheriff's door, of being turned away, of sitting across from this stone-faced, granite-jawed, infuriating man and begging him to look at the evidence again. And all that time John Sullivan had known. The betrayal slammed through her like a fist. "You knew," she breathed. "Yes. You knew, and you said nothing." "Yes." She let go of the doorframe and crossed the room in 4 steps, and she did something she had never done in her 26 years of careful, measured, ladylike life. She grabbed the front of John Sullivan's shirt with both hands and she said, very quietly, "Tell me everything. Right now. You owe me that much." And John Sullivan, who had not let anyone close enough to owe them anything in 7 long years, looked down at this fierce, heartbroken, dust-covered woman whose green eyes were blazing with a fury he honestly felt he deserved, and he said, "Yes, I do." He sat down in his chair. She sat down across from him as he had first asked. And the truth, which had been festering in John Sullivan's chest like a wound that refused to close, finally came out into the light. It had started, as so many dark things in that part of Texas did, with a man named Calhoun Wade. 3 months ago, the morning had been cool and bright, one of those rare October mornings in 1883 when the desert actually smelled like rain that had fallen somewhere nearby. John Sullivan had been at his desk before sunrise, as was his habit, reading through the week's correspondence when the telegram arrived from the county sheriff's office in San Antonio. It said that a man named Daniel Blackwell, aged 23, had been identified as a suspect in the robbery of the First Territorial Bank of Redemption. $2,200 had been taken. 3 witnesses had placed a young man matching Daniel Blackwell's description near the bank in the hours before the robbery. John had read the telegram twice. Then he had pulled out the file he already had on Calhoun Wade. Calhoun Wade was a problem that had followed John Sullivan from his previous posting in Laredo. A man of considerable local influence and considerably less local integrity, who had spent the better part of a decade using that influence to cover his tracks. Wade owned 3 businesses in Redemption, sat on the town council, and contributed generously to the church building fund. He was also, John was almost entirely certain, the man responsible for organizing a series of bank robberies across 3 counties using hired young men who conveniently fit whatever description He needed them to fit at whatever moment he needed them to. Daniel Blackwell had been working at Wade's feed and supply store for 6 weeks before the robbery. The 3 witnesses who had identified Daniel, 2 of them were Wade's own employees. The third was Wade's cousin from out of Abilene who had no business being in Redemption at all except that Wade had brought him there specifically. John had known. He had read those facts and he had known with the clarity of a man who had been doing this work for 15 years exactly what he was looking at. A setup, a trap, an innocent young man being fed to the law so that Calhoun Wade could walk away clean. But John Sullivan had a problem, a dark past problem. A secret that Calhoun Wade had discovered and held over him like a sword, suspended by a single thread. 7 years earlier, when John was 29 and still green enough around the edges to make terrible choices for what he believed were good reasons, he had helped cover up the death of a man in Laredo. Not a murder, an accident. A deputy under John's command had shot a civilian during a chaotic night arrest that had gone catastrophically wrong. And John, faced with a choice between destroying the career of a young deputy who had a pregnant wife and 2 babies at home, and quietly adjusting the incident report to reflect something closer to self-defense, had chosen the latter. The civilian had been reaching for something. John had told himself that for 7 years. He had never fully believed it. Calhoun Wade had somehow acquired documentation of the real incident. A witness statement that had never made it into the official record. A letter from the deputy himself, written in a moment of guilty anguish and never sent, that had nonetheless found its way out of a desk drawer and into Wade's possession through means John could not account for. Wade had sat across from John in this very office, 6 months before Daniel Blackwell ever came to town, and laid those documents on the desk with the calm, practiced smile of a man who had done this before. "You arrest who I tell you to arrest," Wade had said pleasantly. "You look the other way when I tell you to look away, and these documents stay where they are. You step out of line, and I send them to the state attorney's office in Austin, along with a very detailed letter from a very respectable citizen about the corruption he has personally witnessed in the Redemption Sheriff's office." John had not agreed. He had not said a single word. He had looked at Calhoun Wade for a long, measuring moment, and then he had stood up and opened his office door and waited in silence until Wade had gathered his documents and his pleasant smile and walked out. He had thought that was the end of it. Then the telegram about Daniel Blackwell had arrived. "I should have arrested Wade," John told Ellen now, his voice flat and factual in the way it got when he was suppressing something considerable. "I had enough to charge him, even then. Not enough to make it stick in court against a man with his resources and his connections, but enough to try. I should have tried." Ellen was watching him with those green eyes that missed nothing. She had not said a word since he began talking. She had her hands folded in her lap with the careful stillness of a woman holding herself together through sheer force of will, and it was that stillness, that discipline, that made him feel worse than any rage she could have unleashed on him. "Why didn't you?" she asked. John exhaled. "Because I was afraid." The word landed in the quiet office like a stone dropped into still water. "I had spent 15 years building a reputation for honesty," he said. "Everything I was, everything I had made of myself after Laredo, it all sat on that reputation. I told myself I was protecting the office, protecting the badge, that if I went down, the whole system of law in this county went down with me." He paused. "Those were the things I told myself. The truth was simpler and worse. I was afraid of losing everything, and instead I let an innocent young man lose his freedom to protect my own." Ellen stood up. She walked to the window and stood looking out at Main Street with her back to him, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the distant sound of Hattie Morse still sweeping her porch. "He's been in that cell for 3 months, Ellen said quietly. "He turned 23 years old in that cell. He had a job offer in Fort Worth. He was going to save enough to buy his own land. He was going to have a life." She turned around. "What changed? Why are you telling me this now?" John reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a document. He set it on the desk and pushed it toward her. She crossed the room and looked at it. It was a signed statement. 4 pages of dense handwriting already witnessed and notarized by the county clerk's seal. It was a full accounting of everything John had just told her, written in his own hand and signed with his full name. It detailed Wade's extortion. It detailed the manufactured evidence against Daniel. It detailed John's own failure to act when he should have. It was, functionally, the end of John Sullivan's career. "I sent a copy to the state attorney's office in Austin this morning," John said. "And one to the judge in San Antonio. Your brother should be free within the week." Ellen stared at the document, then she looked up at him. "This will cost you everything," she said. "Yes." "You knew that when you wrote it?" "Yes." She sat back down, not because he had asked her to this time, but because her legs needed the chair. She looked at this man, this gruff, guarded, infuriating man who had just voluntarily dismantled the entire structure of his own life to correct a wrong he could have continued hiding indefinitely. Who had chosen this not because he had been caught, not because there was any external force compelling him, but because 3 months of watching Ellen Blackwell walk through his door and fight for her brother with quiet, relentless, unyielding love had apparently done something to the locked and fortified interior of John Sullivan's conscience. Did not know how to feel. The betrayal was still there, hot and real. The fury at what Daniel had suffered was still there, but underneath it something else was happening that she was not ready to examine yet. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "I know. I came to you every week. I showed you evidence. I argued. I pleaded. I know. And every time you sat there with that face like a stone wall and sent me away." John flinched. It was a small movement, barely visible, but she caught it. "Yes," he said. "Why now?" she pressed. "Why this morning?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wagon rattled past and a child shouted something cheerful in the street. The ordinary afternoon continued unaware. "Yesterday," John said finally, "Wade told me he wanted me to plant additional evidence, enough to ensure Daniel wouldn't just serve time but would be sent to the territorial prison in Yuma. 3 to 5 years minimum." His jaw tightened. He said it with that smile of his, like it was nothing, like your brother was nothing. He looked at her. "I sat with that all night, and I thought about you coming in here every week. Every single week, never giving up, never backing down, never losing faith in him. And I thought about what kind of man I was choosing to be." He stopped. Then more quietly, "I also thought about what I would think of myself for the rest of my life if I let that happen and you ever found out, if you ever looked at me the way you're looking at me right now." Ellen was quiet for a long time. "I need to go," she said finally. "I need to go back to the boarding house and think." "Of course." She picked up her hat from the corner of his desk where she always left it when she came in. She was almost to the door when she stopped. "Calhoun Wade," she said, without turning around. "What happens to him?" "He'll be arrested before sundown today," John said. "I have 2 deputies who are honest men and who have been waiting for the word. The state attorney will handle the rest. And those witnesses, the ones who lied, named in the document, all of them." She nodded once. Then she walked out into the blazing afternoon. John Sullivan sat alone in his office for a long time after that, listening to the sound of the town going about its business, and he thought that whatever happened next, he could at least live with himself again. It was a meager comfort, but it was more than he'd had in 7 years. Ellen did not sleep that night. She lay on the narrow bed in Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house and stared at the ceiling, and sorted through everything she was feeling with the methodical care of a woman who had learned early in life that emotions, left unsorted, had a way of taking over when you couldn't afford them to. Her father had died when she and Daniel were young. Her mother had spent 4 years after that slowly fading from the effort of keeping 2 children fed on a schoolteacher's widow's wages before she too had gone. Ellen had been 19 when she buried her mother. Daniel had been 16. She had kept the 2 of them together through sheer will and careful management of every resource available, and she had learned in those years that fear and grief and rage were all perfectly understandable, but they had to wait their turn. She sorted through what she knew, Daniel was innocent. She had always known that. John Sullivan had known it too. He had known it and said nothing, and her brother had spent 3 months in a cell. That was the betrayal. That was real, and she was not going to pretend otherwise or soften it into something easier to carry. But there was also this. John Sullivan, who had everything to lose and no one forcing his hand, had chosen this morning to lose it. He had put his career, his reputation, and his freedom on a document and sent it to Austin because continuing to do nothing had become something he could no longer do. Something, or someone, had broken through whatever wall he had built around himself. She thought about the way he had looked at her. That unguarded, frightened look that had nothing to do with Calhoun Wade or the law or any external threat at all. It had been the look of a man who was afraid of what she thought of him. Not afraid of consequences, afraid of her judgment specifically. She pressed her hands over her face in the dark and breathed. She had noticed John Sullivan in ways she hadn't wanted to notice him. From the very first week, when she had walked into his office with her carpetbag still in her hand and her stagecoach dust still on her coat, she had noticed things about him that she had firmly told herself were irrelevant. The steadiness of his hands, the way he listened, even when he was clearly not going to act on what he heard, with a focus that made you feel genuinely attended to. The lines around his eyes that suggested a life lived in complicated weather, both actual and metaphorical. He was not a handsome man in any conventional sense, but he had a face that repaid attention, a face that had been through things and had the marks of it, and something in her had responded to that in a way she found deeply inconvenient. She had told herself it was irrelevant because he was the obstacle between her and her brother's freedom, and she could not afford to think of him as anything other than that. Now the obstacle was gone. Now he had removed it himself at considerable personal cost. And she was lying in the dark thinking about the look in his gray eyes, and she was angry at herself for it. She got up at first light. The next 4 days were a controlled storm of logistics and correspondence. Ellen wrote to Daniel immediately, explaining everything as clearly and calmly as she could, knowing that nothing she wrote could adequately prepare him for the emotional upheaval of what was coming, but wanting him to hear it from her before he heard it from anyone official. She wrote to the judge in San Antonio herself, as a supporting voice to the documents John had already sent, adding her own account of the weeks of evidence she had brought to the sheriff's office and been turned away. She did this not out of any desire to damage John further, but because she believed the fullest picture served justice best, and she had never been a woman who softened inconvenient truths. She heard through the town's efficient gossip network that Calhoun Wade had been arrested Thursday afternoon, just as John had promised, that his lawyer from San Antonio had arrived on the Friday stage looking extremely unhappy, and that the 2 deputy witnesses who had worked for Wade had turned state's evidence faster than anyone expected, apparently having been waiting for exactly this opportunity. She did not go to John's office. She told herself she was giving him space to deal with the administrative consequences of what he had done. That was true as far as it went. The deeper truth was that she didn't know what she would say to him, and she had never in her adult life entered a conversation without knowing what she intended to say. On the 5th day, a telegram arrived from Daniel. She opened it standing in the doorway of Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house with the morning sun just clearing the ridge to the east and casting everything in a warm copper light. The telegram was brief. Daniel had been released the previous afternoon. He was in San Antonio. He was well, or he would be. He thanked her. He said he would come to redemption when he was strong enough for the journey. He said at the end, something that made her throat tighten. I hear the sheriff there is a complicated man. I hear you have been fighting very hard. I cannot wait to see you. She folded the telegram carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress, and she stood in the copper morning for a while, feeling something unknot in her chest that had been wound tight for 3 months. Then she picked up her hat, put it on, and walked down Main Street to the sheriff's office. John was at his desk. He was always at his desk at this hour. He looked up when the door opened and something moved across his face that he didn't quite manage to suppress before he arranged it back into his customary steadiness. "Daniel was released," she said. "I wanted you to know." "I know," he said. "I got word yesterday afternoon." "Of course you did." She sat down in the chair across from him without being asked. "How are things here?" He looked at her for a moment with the wariness of a man who has learned through hard experience that direct questions are rarely as simple as they sound. Wade's attorney filed an objection this morning. It won't go anywhere. The state attorney's office is taking it seriously. My testimony is scheduled for next month. He paused. The town council met last night, and they've asked for my resignation. She had expected it. She felt it anyway. Are you going to give it to them? I haven't decided. He looked out the window. I think I probably should. Whether I had good reasons or not, I failed in my duty. The badge means something. If I stay in this office after what I let happen, I'm not sure what it means anymore. Ellen considered this. It was a profoundly honest answer from a man she was learning, tended toward honesty, when he was not cornered by his own fear. "I think," she said carefully, "that a man who has genuinely reckoned with what he did wrong is often better positioned to do right than a man who has never been tested." John looked at her. "Is that an argument for keeping my job or a philosophical observation?" "It's an observation," she said. "What you do with it is your business." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. John Sullivan did not appear to be a man who smiled easily, but there was a quality of warmth around his eyes that she recognized now as the equivalent. "Why did you come here?" he asked. "I told you to tell you about Daniel. You could have sent a note." She held his gaze. "I could have." The silence between them held more than either of them was saying, and they both knew it, and the knowledge of that sat in the office between them like a warm and complicated presence. "Miss Blackwell," he said, and his voice had dropped into a register she hadn't heard before. "I want to say something else, something I haven't found a way to say yet." "You seem to have difficulty with that," she said, and there was the faintest edge of dry humor in it that surprised her as much as it appeared to surprise him. "I'm aware," he said. "It's a documented failing." He set down the pen he had been holding without realizing it. "What I did to your brother was a wrong I cannot repair. The 3 months you lost, the money you spent coming here, the work you missed, the worry. None of that can be given back, I know that. I'm not going to insult you by suggesting that what I did eventually do changes what I failed to do before." "No," she agreed quietly. "It doesn't. But I want you to know," he said, and his voice was very careful now, the voice of a man choosing each word with full awareness of its weight, "that you coming here every week changed something in me. I know that's a strange thing to say. I know it probably sounds like I'm making your suffering into something that was good for me, and I don't mean it that way. I mean that watching you fight for someone you loved without ceasing, without backing down when every official door was closed to you, when I kept turning you away." He stopped, started again. "You made me ashamed of who I had become, and then you made me want to be something better. I don't know if that matters to you. I think probably it shouldn't, given the circumstances, but I wanted to say it." Ellen looked at him for a long time. She thought about the 17 different ways she could respond to that. She thought about the things that were still true, that Daniel had suffered, that she was still angry. That trust was not a door you opened because someone knocked hard enough. It was a door that had to be earned back board by board and hinge by hinge. She thought about all of that. She also thought about the fact that she had been thinking about John Sullivan's face in the dark, and that she had walked down Main Street this morning knowing full well she could have sent a note, and that she had come here anyway. "I'm not leaving Redemption yet," she said finally. "Daniel will come here when he's recovered, and I'm going to stay until he does. After that, I don't know." She stood up. "I'll be in town for at least 3 weeks. If you're inclined toward conversation, I'm not opposed to it." She walked out. Behind her, she heard the faintest sound, barely audible, that might have been John Sullivan exhaling for the first time in a very long while. What followed was the strangest and most quietly extraordinary 3 weeks of Ellen Blackwell's life. John did not pursue her with the aggressive romantic energy she had occasionally encountered from men who mistook interest for entitlement. He did not send flowers or poems or make large gestures. He was constitutionally incapable of large gestures, she suspected, and under different circumstances that might have been a limitation. Under these circumstances, it turned out to be exactly right. What he did was talk to her. He came to the Sunday social at the church hall, which surprised everyone in Redemption, because apparently John Sullivan had not attended a social event voluntarily since arriving in town 4 years ago. He sat at the end of a long table eating Hattie Morse's excellent cornbread and listening to Ellen describe, with forensic precision and some rueful humor, the exact chaos of the stagecoach journey she had taken to get to Redemption, the broken wheel outside of Mesilla, the traveling salesman who had sold her what turned out to be a very convincing counterfeit travel almanac, the fact that she had arrived 2 days later than expected and on empty pockets. He did not laugh easily, but he listened with such complete attention that she found herself talking more than she usually did, excavating stories from the past 3 months that she hadn't thought were particularly worth telling until his gray eyes were on her, and suddenly everything seemed worth examining. She asked him about his work, not about Wade, not about Daniel, but about the daily reality of keeping order in a town of 800 people at the edge of the Texas frontier in 1883. He talked about it in the same careful, factual way he apparently talked about everything, but she could hear underneath the measured language a genuine investment in the work. He cared about this town. He cared about the people in it. The failure with Daniel had not been a failure of caring, she understood now. It had been a failure of courage at a crucial moment, and those were different things, and one was more forgivable than the other. She did not forgive him all at once. She thought it would be dishonest to herself, and dishonest to him, to pretend the wound was healed simply because she could see the man behind it more clearly. But she let herself know him. She gave herself permission to find him interesting, and complicated, and increasingly dear. He walked her back from the church social to the boarding house, and at the gate he stopped and said, "I'm glad you came tonight," and she said, "So am I," and the simplicity of it was almost startling. On Wednesday he came to the boarding house for supper. Mrs. Hartwell, who was a romantic of the most unrepentant sort, had extended the invitation herself and seemed inordinately pleased with the result. They sat at the long dining table with 2 other boarders and Mrs. Hartwell herself and talked about everything and nothing, and John helped clear the dishes without being asked, which made Mrs. Hartwell give Ellen a look of pure approval that Ellen pretended not to see. On Thursday he showed her the town, which she thought she already knew after 3 months but discovered she had only seen the surface of. He showed her the Mexican families who had been in this part of Texas since before any of the Anglo settlers arrived, and who still grew the best chilies in 3 counties. He showed her the Comanche trading routes, long disused, that you could still trace in the landscape if you knew what to look for. He talked about the land with a respect that she found genuine and moving, the particular reverence of a man who has spent years in a landscape and learned to read it. He had grown up in Missouri, he told her. Redemption was the first place he had ever felt like staying. Until now, he said, and then looked as though he hadn't entirely meant to say that aloud. "What does that mean?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. They were standing on the low ridge north of town where you could see the whole of Redemption laid out below, the white-painted church steeple and the brown adobe of the older buildings and the cottonwood trees along the creek catching the late afternoon light. "The council hasn't formally accepted my resignation yet," he said. "I gave it to them on Monday. They asked for a week to consider whether they want it. I think there are 3 or 4 of them who believe I should stay. I don't know what I want them to decide." He looked at her. "A week ago I thought I knew what came next. Resign, face the inquiry in Austin, accept whatever professional consequences resulted, and then find something else to do with myself somewhere else. That seemed clear enough." He paused. "Now it seems less clear." Ellen looked at the town below them. "If you stayed," she said, "what would that look like?" "A lot of difficult conversations," he said honestly. "People here who feel I betrayed their trust, which is fair, proving over time that I'm the man I should have been from the start. It's slow, unglamorous work." He paused. "There's also the matter of the inquiry in Austin, which will be public and somewhat undignified." "You don't seem like a man afraid of undignified things," she said, "as long as they're honest." He looked at her sideways. "No, I suppose I'm not." She turned to face him properly. The wind was coming up from the south and it caught her hair and she pushed it back with her hand, the practical, unself-conscious gesture of a woman not performing anything for anyone. "John," she said, using his first name for the first time deliberately, and watched something wake up in his expression. "I'm going to say something and I want you to hear it in the spirit it's meant." "All right," he said carefully. "I came to redemption for Daniel. That was the only reason. I had no intention of remaining here or of finding anything here besides justice for my brother." She held his gaze. "I'm aware that circumstances changed the situation somewhat." "Somewhat," he agreed, very dry. "I'm also aware that I don't have a plan for what comes next for me. Daniel will come here and recover, and after that, I don't know where either of us will be. I had a teaching position in Abilene that I left to come here, and I don't know if it's still available." She took a breath. "What I'm saying is that I don't have a tidy answer to offer you. I don't know what I'm doing, but I am not interested in staying." A long pause. "That was a great many negatives," John said. "It was an honest answer." It was. Something moved across his face. "I'll take it." Daniel arrived on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after his release, on the stage from San Antonio, looking thinner and older than the brother she remembered, but with the same quick eyes and the set of his jaw that had always reminded her of their father. Ellen was waiting at the stage stop, and she held him for a long time without saying anything, and he held her back with a grip that said everything. That evening, when Daniel was settled into the boarding house and had eaten 3 plates of Mrs. Hartwell's food and was sitting on the porch in the cool night air, he asked Ellen to sit with him, and they talked for a long time about everything that had happened. "Tell me about the sheriff," Daniel said eventually. Ellen was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark street. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Daniel said. "Because when I was sitting in that cell and I got your letter explaining what he had done and what he had then done to fix it, I spent a long time thinking about it. About a man who is capable of both of those things." He looked at her. "And then I thought about how you'd been going to his office every week for 3 months, and I know you, Ellen. I know when something is just work and when something is something else." She looked at her hands. "It's complicated. Most worthwhile things are," she told him then, more honestly than she had allowed herself to articulate even internally. About the anger that was still there and always would be in some form. About the respect that had grown around and underneath the anger like a plant finding its way through difficult ground. About the feeling that she understood John Sullivan in some essential way that had nothing to do with approving of everything he had done, and that understanding felt important. "He made a terrible choice," Daniel said carefully, "and then he made a much harder and much better one. I was the one in the cell, Ellen. If I can see that, you're allowed to see it too." She looked at her brother. "Are you saying I should forgive him?" "I'm saying you already have," Daniel said simply. "The question is whether you're going to do anything about it." The next day, John Sullivan appeared at the boarding house at 10 in the morning, hat in hand, and asked if Daniel would be willing to speak with him. It was a brave thing to ask. Ellen recognized it as such. He was not required to face Daniel directly. He had already made his legal accounting, his official reckoning. This was personal, and it was uncomfortable, and he came anyway. Daniel received him in Mrs. Hartwell's sitting room, and Ellen sat in the corner and said nothing while John Sullivan looked at the young man he had failed and said, simply and without excuse, that he was sorry. That he had made a choice driven by his own fear and self-preservation that had cost Daniel 3 months of his life, and that there was nothing adequate he could offer in response to that except the full truth and the legal action that he hoped would result in genuine justice. And his word, for whatever that was worth anymore, that he would never make such a choice again. Daniel listened to all of it. He was 23 years old and he had just spent 3 months in a cell he didn't deserve, and he had his father's eyes and his sister's steadiness. And when John Sullivan finished speaking, Daniel said, "I believe you," and then he said, "I don't forgive easily and I'm not going to pretend this is over, but I believe you, that's a start." John nodded. He looked at Ellen once before he left, just once quickly, and then he was gone. Daniel looked at his sister. "He's in love with you," he said. "Daniel, he looked at you like the answer to everything, and then left before he could make it uncomfortable," Daniel said. "That's what that was." Ellen pressed her lips together against an expression she didn't want to have in front of her younger brother. "Don't be smug," she said. "I'm just saying what I see," Daniel said pleasantly. The council made their decision that Thursday. They voted to allow John to remain as sheriff, 4-3, with the condition that he submit to the full state inquiry without objection, and that the results of that inquiry be public. He accepted the terms without apparent difficulty. Ellen heard about it through the town and then heard it again directly from John when she ran into him on Main Street Friday morning. "Congratulations," she said. "Or condolences," he said. "I haven't decided which yet." "How is the inquiry looking?" "Honest," he said, which appeared to be his highest descriptor for anything. "The state attorney in Austin is a fair man. He's not trying to make an example of me just to establish the facts. My deputy's involvement in the Laredo situation is going to be public knowledge now, which I feel worse about than anything else." He paused. "His wife knows. I went to Laredo last week and told her myself before it became official. She was angrier at me than at him, which I understand." Ellen stared at him. "You went to Laredo to tell her personally. It was her right to know before she read it in a newspaper." She stared at him a moment longer. He looked mildly puzzled by her reaction. "John," she said slowly, "you are a profoundly exasperating man. I've been told. Because you do things like that, things that are genuinely remarkable, and you mention them as though they're just items on a list, as though going 300 miles to spare a woman unnecessary public humiliation is just ordinary decency." He seemed to consider this. "It is ordinary decency." "It is not. Most men do not do it." She took a breath. "Most men would never in a million years make the choices you've made this month." Something in his expression shifted. "I should have made them 3 months ago." "Yes, you should have. That's also true." She looked at him steadily. "Both things can be true, John." He held her gaze. The Friday morning sun was already fierce and the street was busy around them. Horses and wagons and Hattie Morse's daughter running an errand and Tom Gibbs opening up the general store. Ordinary life moving around them like water around 2 rocks. "Ellen," John said very quietly, "I would like to call on you, formally, if you'll allow it." The word formally, the deliberateness of it. The fact that he was asking rather than assuming, that he was naming it clearly rather than letting it remain in that comfortable, ambiguous middle ground they had occupied for 3 weeks. She thought about Daniel saying he looked at you like the answer to everything. "Yes," she said, "I'll allow it." The calling began that Sunday. What followed over the next month was, Ellen would later tell people who asked, simultaneously the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing she had ever experienced. They went walking. They had supper together, sometimes with Daniel, sometimes just the 2 of them at the hotel dining room where the food was decent and the room was relatively private. They sat on the porch of the boarding house in the evenings and talked, and sometimes didn't talk, just sat with the comfortable quiet of 2 people who were learning that they fit together in silence as well as in conversation. John was not a demonstrative man. He did not use more words than necessary. He did not exaggerate or perform. He was not romantically theatrical in any way. But he was present in a way that Ellen had never experienced from anyone, a complete and focused attention that made her feel, when she was with him, like the most substantial person in the room. He remembered everything she said. He asked questions that proved he had been thinking about their previous conversations. He brought her a book he thought she might like, a collection of botanical essays, because she had mentioned offhand 3 weeks earlier that she had studied botany informally before money had made further education impossible, and he had ordered it from the bookshop in San Antonio 2 days after she mentioned it. She didn't know he had done that until it arrived. She stood in the boarding house with the package open in her hands and looked at the book and felt something warm and irrevocable happen in her chest. She went to his office. "You remembered that," she said, holding up the book. "You mentioned it once," he said, as though that were a normal and unremarkable thing. "You said you had wanted to study it formally but never had the chance. I thought you might enjoy having something to read." "John." "Yes." She put the book down on his desk and leaned across it and kissed him. It was not a calculated thing. It was the most uncalculated thing she had done in years, possibly ever. His hands, after one startled moment, came up to her face, with a gentleness that she hadn't expected from hands that looked like his, weathered and large and work-hardened, and he kissed her back with a careful, thorough tenderness that said a great many things without a single word. When they separated, he looked at her with those gray eyes that were not, she now knew, cold at all, just deeply private, and he said, "I should have brought you a book months ago." She laughed, actually laughed, surprised out of it, and his face did the thing it did that wasn't quite a smile but was better. Daniel, who was recovering his health and his spirits with remarkable speed on Mrs. Hartwell's cooking and the general goodwill of the town, decided at the end of his 3rd week in redemption that he wanted to stay. Not forever, necessarily, but long enough to think. He had been offered work at the livery stable by its owner, a solid and fair-minded man named Arthur Reeves, who had heard Daniel's story and felt the town owed him something, which was one of redemption's better impulses finding its practical expression. Daniel, who had always been good with horses, accepted. Ellen watched her brother settling into a life and felt something in her own future become less formless. She had written to Abilene about the teaching position and learned it had indeed been filled. She had also, quietly, spoken to the woman currently running the small school in Redemption, who was planning to move to Tucson in the spring to be near her children, and who had raised the question of whether Ellen might consider taking over the position. She had not answered yet, but she was thinking about it. One evening in late November, when the air had finally cooled to something bearable, and the smell of wood smoke was coming from the houses along the creek, John took her walking out past the North Ridge to a place where you could see the stars without the interference of the town's lantern light. The sky in that part of Texas was enormous and absolute, a deep black certainty studded with more light than seemed possible or fair. They stood looking at it for a while without speaking. "I need to tell you something," John said. The phrase gave her a reflexive flutter of alarm, a residual response to all the times those words had preceded hard news. She looked at him. "The inquiry in Austin is scheduled for the 1st week of January," he said. "It's possible, depending on how the testimony goes, that I'll lose the badge permanently. Even with the 4-3 vote here, the state has the final word on my licensure." He was looking at the stars. "I want you to know that before things go any further between us, because I have made myself a very uncertain prospect in terms of practical stability, and I think you deserve to make your decisions with clear information." Ellen considered this. The stars turned above them with their indifferent grandeur. "What would you do," she asked, "if you lost the badge?" "I've thought about it," he said. "I have some savings. I know this land. I've been thinking for a while about whether I could make something of a small parcel north of town. The land is cheaper here than in Missouri or Kansas. There's decent water if you dig for it." He paused. "I'm 36 years old and I'm aware that starting over is not a young man's game, but I've done it before." "You have," she said. "You did it after Laredo." "Yes," he looked at her. "The difference this time is that I would be doing it honestly." She turned to face him fully. In the starlight his face was all plains and shadow, the face of a man who had lived with considerable difficulty and hadn't let it make him cruel, which was a more significant achievement than it sometimes sounded. "John," she said, I came to redemption with nothing but a carpetbag and a will to fight. I have built nothing before from worse material than you are describing. Uncertainty does not frighten me." "I know," he said softly. "It's one of approximately 100 things I admire about you." She felt the warmth of that move through her. "Approximately 100. I haven't finished counting." The almost smile. "I may have undercounted." She took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands with an expression of such unguarded feeling that she found herself needing to look away for a moment at the enormous sky, at the stars that did not care about any of this, and she was grateful for the scale of the world that could hold all of it and still turn. "I'm going to take the teaching position," she said. "In the spring, when Mrs. Canton leaves. I spoke with her last week." He was very still beside her. "I'm going to stay in redemption," she said, "whatever the January inquiry decides." "Ellen, I'm telling you so that you know," she said. "You made decisions so I would have clear information. I'm extending the same courtesy." He turned toward her and the hand that wasn't holding hers came up and touched her face, the way it had when she had kissed him across his desk, with that careful, disbelieving tenderness that made her feel like something precious being held by someone who was very aware of the value of precious things. "I love you," he said, simply, directly, the way he did everything. She looked at him in the vast Arizona starlight and felt the last closed door in her chest come open. "I love you too," she said, "despite your considerable number of documented failings." "A generous and accurate assessment," he said, and kissed her. The January inquiry was held in Austin over 4 days and was, as John had predicted, public and somewhat undignified. Ellen did not go because she had her teaching responsibilities and because she trusted him to face it alone, which she recognized as itself a form of love, the willingness to let someone face their own reckoning. She had been willing to fight for him if needed, but she understood that this particular fight was his. He came back on a Thursday afternoon and came directly to the schoolhouse without stopping at the office first, which she later decided was everything she needed to know about his priorities. She was teaching when he appeared in the doorway, and she looked up and the children looked up, and she read his face across the room with the fluency of someone who had spent considerable time learning that particular language. "Class," she said, "I believe we'll stop 5 minutes early today." The children, who were not going to argue with that, gathered their things with controlled chaos and filed out past John Sullivan, who stepped aside and held the door and said, "Afternoon," to each of them with grave courtesy, which made 3 of the girls giggle and made several of the boys stand up straighter. When they were gone, he closed the door. "Well," she said. "I keep the badge," he said, "with conditions. 2 years of supervised review, quarterly reports to the state office, public record of the Blackwell case and the Wade case maintained for 5 years. He paused. "The Laredo deputy is being asked to resign his current position. That's the part I feel worst about." "You didn't cause that," Ellen said quietly. "The cascade of consequences from that night in Laredo is not your fault alone." "I know. I'll carry some of it anyway." He looked at her. "I've accepted that." She crossed the room and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back with the contained ferocity of a man who had been holding himself together by himself for a very long time and was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to let someone else help. Spring came to redemption in the incremental way of high desert springs, the cottonwoods going green along the creek, the wildflowers appearing in the places you least expected them, the mornings cool enough still to see your breath, but with a warmth underneath the air that promised something. John proposed to Ellen on the first warm evening in March, on the same ridge north of town where he had told her about the inquiry, where they had stood looking at the enormous sky. He had not planned a speech, which was appropriate for a man who was not a speech giver by nature, and what he said was essentially that he had spent most of his adult life being careful and controlled and self-sufficient, and that he had recently discovered that caring for someone else was actually better in every measurable way, and that he would very much like to spend the rest of his life caring for her specifically if she would consent to that arrangement. It was possibly the least conventionally romantic proposal ever offered in that part of Texas. Ellen said yes before he finished the sentence. They were married in June in the white-painted church where John had attended his first social event, with Daniel standing as witness, and Mrs. Hartwell crying with complete abandon in the second pew and the better part of redemption present, because small towns in 1883 treated a wedding as a community event, and no one had told John Sullivan this beforehand, so his expression when he arrived to find the church full was one Ellen saved and carried with her. The ceremony was simple. What Ellen remembered of it afterward was not any particular word, but the look on John's face when she walked down the aisle, the way his composure very nearly broke, the way he visibly gathered it back, the way he held her hands at the altar with a grip that was not at all composed, and the way when the minister said, "You may kiss your bride," John Sullivan, who was gruff and private and constitutionally incapable of public display, kissed her with a thoroughness that made the church erupt. Daniel whistled. Mrs. Hartwell cried harder. The summer that followed was the kind of summer that later becomes the point of reference, the summer you mean when you say that was when things were good. John continued as sheriff with the dogged, honest rigor that was his natural mode now that he was not fighting himself. He rebuilt his standing in the town not through charm, but through the accumulated evidence of being the man he had promised to be, and redemption, which was not a sentimental town, but was a fair-minded one, gave him that credit slowly and genuinely. Ellen taught 22 children in a one-room schoolhouse and discovered in herself a talent for it she had suspected, but never fully had the chance to exercise. She loved the work with a completeness that surprised her. She loved the particular challenge of holding 22 different minds in motion at once, of finding the approach that worked for the stubborn boy in the back row who was actually brilliant, but had been told all his life that he wasn't, of watching a child who had arrived in September, unable to read, go home in December with a book under her arm. She and John argued sometimes, because they were both stubborn, opinionated people with strong views on most subjects, and because the deep privacy that was John's protective reflex occasionally manifested as a withdrawal that she had to specifically name and address. She had learned to name it. He had learned, slowly and with effort, to not withdraw when things were difficult, and to understand that her naming the withdrawal was not an attack but an invitation. They were getting better at it. In late September, Ellen knew she was expecting a child. She told John on a Sunday evening, sitting on the porch of the house he had built on the north parcel of land where he had once told her he thought he might start over, the house that was small but solid and sat with its back to a ridge and its face to the south where you got the best of the desert light. She told him simply and directly, the way she did everything. He sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "Ellen," in a voice she had not heard before, low and unsteady, and he took her hand. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm more than all right," he said, and his voice was rough with something she recognized as happiness in a man who was not entirely practiced at experiencing it. "I'm grateful," he said, "more grateful than I know how to say." "That's all right," she said. "I know, I can tell." He looked at her with those gray eyes in the evening light. "You usually can," he said. "That's one of the things I love about you." "Approximately 100 things," she reminded him. "I've updated the count," he said. It was a significant underestimate. Daniel, when told, reacted with the uncomplicated joy of a young man who had been given back his life and his sister, and more future than he had thought he was going to have. He also began spending considerable time with a young woman named Rosa Reyes, whose family were among the long-established Mexican families John had pointed out to Ellen in the early days of their acquaintance. Rosa was 20 and sharp and funny, and appeared to find Daniel's particular combination of horse sense and nervous sincerity extremely winning. Ellen watched this with quiet pleasure. The inquiry's 2-year review period ended without incident. John's quarterly reports apparently satisfied the state office in Austin, and when the formal review concluded, The supervisor who had been assigned to his case wrote a letter for the public record that John read once and put away with the same equanimity with which he received everything. Ellen read it. It said, in the formal language of official correspondence, that Sheriff John Sullivan had demonstrated in the review period an uncommonly consistent standard of professional and ethical conduct, and that the events of 1883 appeared to represent not a character failing, but a human failure of courage that had been comprehensively addressed. It was not a completely exonerating document, and it was not meant to be, but it was honest. "You should be proud of this," she told him. "I'm satisfied with it," he said. "Proud seems like a lot given how it came about. Being proud of who you've become doesn't require being proud of everything that happened on the way," she said. He considered this. "I'll think about that. That's all I ask," she said. Their son was born in April, on a morning when the desert was doing its spectacular spring best, the wildflowers out in such abundance along the North Ridge that you could see the color from a quarter-mile away. He was healthy and loud and had John's gray eyes and Ellen's dark hair, and appeared from the first hours of his life to have strong opinions about everything, which everyone who knew either of his parents found entirely predictable. They named him Thomas, after Ellen's father. John held his son for the first time with the careful, slightly overwhelmed expression of a man encountering something for which his extensive practical competence had not prepared him, and Ellen watched from the bed where she was exhausted and perfectly content, and thought that this was the image she would carry when she needed to remember what things being right looked like. "He's very small," John said, looking down at the baby with a concern that was plainly about the responsibility rather than any lack of delight. "He will get bigger," Ellen said. "Yes." John looked up at her. "Are you all right?" "I am wonderful," she said, and meant it precisely. Little Thomas Sullivan grew with the speed that babies employ to surprise everyone who thought they had just gotten used to the current version. He was walking by the time the cottonwoods turned gold that autumn, and talking in the determined, fragmentary way of a child who has too much to say and not yet enough words for it. And he had John's focused attention span, which manifested in a toddler as a willingness to spend 40 minutes examining a single interesting rock. Daniel and Rosa were married in the spring, a cheerful, bilingual celebration that combined the Anglo and Mexican traditions of both families in a way that redemption mostly embraced, because it had been improving on this front over the 4 years since Ellen and John had arrived, not perfectly, not without friction, but with an increasing willingness among the better-minded residents to recognize that the town was richer for what all its families brought to it. John had had something to do with that, quietly in the way he did things, not through speeches, but through the accumulated weight of his daily conduct, and the explicit equality with which he applied the law to every person in redemption regardless of their origin. It was not a small thing. In 1885 in that part of Texas, it was genuinely not a small thing. Calhoun Wade's trial had concluded the previous year in a conviction on 3 counts of fraud and conspiracy, which had sent him to prison in Huntsville for 7 years. The 2 false witnesses had received shorter sentences in exchange for their full testimony. The cousin from Abilene had vanished before he could be formally charged, which was the one loose thread that occasionally irritated John, but it did not keep him awake. What kept John awake, and he would admit this now without embarrassment because Ellen had made the admitting of things considerably easier for him, were the occasional nights when the Laredo incident came back to him. The deputy, the civilian, the choice that had cascaded into everything else. He had never found a way to make complete peace with it, because there was no version of that night that ended without the choice being wrong, and he was not a man who could convince himself otherwise. What he had found was a way to carry it that didn't crush him, to keep it as a fact about his past rather than a definition of his present. Ellen had helped him find that too, though she would say, if asked, that she had only helped him say the thing he had already arrived at. By the summer of 1886, redemption had grown. There was a new bank, carefully and publicly regulated. There were 2 more schools because the population had nearly doubled. The hotel had been expanded. A proper telegraph office had replaced the cramped setup in the general store. John had hired 2 additional deputies and was training a third, a methodical process that everyone who watched it recognized as John essentially ensuring that the office could function on principles rather than personalities. Ellen's school had also expanded. She now had an assistant teacher, a young woman named Clara Bates who had arrived from Ohio with a teaching certificate and an enthusiasm for pedagogy that Ellen found both refreshing and occasionally exhausting. She mentored Clara with the same direct, unhurried method she used for everything. And Clara, who had been warned that the schoolteacher's wife was not a soft touch, discovered that she was also deeply fair and unexpectedly funny and precisely the kind of person you wanted in your corner. Thomas was 2.5 and had become in that time the unofficial mascot of the sheriff's office, because John occasionally brought him in on weekend mornings when Ellen had school paperwork to finish. And the deputies, 2 young men named Garrett and Hicks, who were both genuinely good at their work and both utterly helpless in the face of a toddler who regarded their hat collection as an interactive exhibit, had apparently adopted him collectively. Ellen was expecting their second child. She told John in the same way she had told him the first time, sitting on the porch in the evening, directly and simply. It was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Thomas is going to be insufferably pleased with himself," and she laughed so hard she had to put her hand over her mouth. "He is," she agreed. "He already acts as though he runs the household." "He gets that from you," John said. "He absolutely does not. He gets that from you. You walk into a room and it reorganizes itself around you. That's the badge." "That is not the badge. The badge is just the visual confirmation of something that was already there." She looked at him. "You have always been the kind of man rooms reorganize around. It just took you a while to use it for the right things." He looked at her for a long moment in the evening light, this woman who had arrived in his life like a reckoning and stayed like a grace, who had seen every unflattering and compromised thing about him and decided to stay anyway, who had built something here alongside him with the same relentless, practical, quiet love with which she did everything. "Ellen," he said, "yes, I am aware that I am not an easy man, that I was not easy before, and that I remain, on balance, somewhat difficult." "Somewhat," she agreed. "I am also aware," he continued, "that whatever good I have managed since 1883 has been substantially enabled by you. Not caused by you, because I don't want to suggest that you are responsible for my choices, but enabled. You showed me what it looked like to be a person who does not stop, who does not compromise the essential thing, and I have tried to be that person." She reached over and took his hand. "You have been that person," she said. "Not perfectly, neither have I, but honestly." "Honestly," he agreed. "That's all I ever really wanted." "I know," she said. "It's one of the things I love about you." "How many things by now?" she pretended to consider. "The count is classified." "Fair," he said, and the almost smile became, for once, a full and genuine one, unguarded and warm, and all the more beautiful for how rarely it appeared. The second child was a girl. She arrived in March of 1887, loud and decisive from the first moment, and they named her Catherine after John's mother, a woman he had spoken of with a reverence that told Ellen everything she needed to know about where his capacity for genuine tenderness had been forged, in a Missouri farmhouse with a woman who had apparently loved her serious, watchful son with complete patience. Thomas, aged 3, received his sister with the combination of fascination and proprietary concern that Ellen had predicted exactly. He stood at the edge of the cradle and looked down at her with John's focused attention and said, with great seriousness, "She is very small." "Yes," John said, standing behind him. "She will get bigger." Thomas considered this. "All right," he said, with the tone of a man accepting a reasonable arrangement. Ellen, from the bed, pressed her face into the pillow to muffle her laughter. Redemption in 1887 was not the same town it had been in 1883. The frontier was contracting. The great cattle drives were changing in character as the railroads pushed further west and the economics of the range shifted. There were men in Austin and Washington making decisions about land and water and the future of the territory that would reshape everything within another decade. John followed these developments with the attention he gave everything, with the awareness of a man who understood that the law he served was only as good as the society it reflected, and that societies were not static. He had long conversations with the Mexican families and the few remaining Comanche traders he encountered about what they saw coming, and he listened to them with a seriousness that they recognized and reciprocated. He could not change the large forces at work. He could ensure that in his town, in his jurisdiction, the law was applied with consistency and humanity to everyone. It was a limited ambition in the face of vast injustice, and he was honest with himself about that limitation. But he kept doing it. Ellen had made peace with the West in her own way. She had arrived as an outsider from Abilene, a city woman in practical terms, and she had become over 4 years someone who knew this landscape in her bones, who could read the weather in the color of the morning sky, and who had strong opinions about the best place to find water in a dry season, and who had once, memorably, identified a diamondback rattlesnake in the classroom before any of her students could disturb it. Dispatched it with the calm efficiency of a woman who had learned early that the world contained dangers that did not wait for you to be ready. She loved redemption. She loved it with the particular depth of love that is available to people who choose a place rather than simply land in it, who put down roots deliberately and tend them consciously. She loved the big sky and the dry air and the cottonwoods and the ridiculous abundance of stars and the smell of the desert after rain, and the people who had become, over 4 years, her neighbors and friends, and in some cases family. She loved most of all coming home in the evenings to the house on the north parcel, where the light hit the south-facing windows in the late afternoon and turned everything gold, where Thomas was usually involved in some complicated project in the yard that required more sticks than any reasonable project should require, where Catherine was in whatever room John was in because she had from her earliest comprehension understood that her father was a safe harbor and had established herself in his vicinity accordingly, where John would hear the gate and come to the door and look at her with those gray eyes and the quality of attention that had never diminished and said, still, everything without. Any words at all. He said a lot with words now. He was still not a man who talked for its own sake, but she had learned, and he had learned, and the language between them was fluent in ways that words were only part of. He knew what she needed when she had a hard day. She knew when he was carrying something he hadn't said yet, and she knew how to create the space in which he could say it. They had built that between them over 4 years the way you build anything good, with attention and patience, and the willingness to keep trying when the first method didn't work. In the spring of 1888, John Sullivan was re-elected as sheriff of Redemption County without opposition. The town voted with the thoroughness of a community that had seen what it looked like when the law was misused, and had seen what it looked like when it was done honestly, and had formed a clear preference. He came home that evening and found Ellen sitting on the porch in the late sun with Catherine in her lap and Thomas conducting military operations in the yard with a collection of sticks and a very patient old hound dog named Marshall who had appeared at the office door 2 years ago and stayed. And he stood at the gate for a moment just looking at all of it. Ellen looked up. She read his face. "Well," she said. "Re-elected," he said. "Of course you were," she said. He opened the gate and came up the path and stepped up onto the porch and bent down and kissed her, which made Catherine produce a sound of extreme indignation because she had been displaced from the center of attention, and Thomas yelled from the yard, "Papa's home," and came running with the dog at his heels, and for a moment there was the cheerful chaos that is the natural habitat of a family that has found its shape. When it settled, John sat down in the chair beside her and Catherine arranged herself in his lap, and Thomas sat on the porch steps and asked what re-elected meant, and was given a clear and honest explanation that he received with the seriousness of a 5-year-old who is going to need to think about this. The evening deepened. The desert went through its extravagant color changes, copper to rose to the deep violet that preceded the dark. The stars came out. The ones Ellen had stood under in November of 1883, with a man who was not yet hers, but was already becoming someone she could not imagine being without. "John," she said quietly when Thomas had gone inside for supper and Catherine had fallen asleep in his lap. "Yes," he said. "Do you remember what you said to me, that first night on the North Ridge?" "Approximately," he said. "You said Redemption was the first place you had ever felt like staying, and then you said until now." She looked at him. "I never asked you what you meant by that." He looked at her. The violet had deepened to the first true dark and the stars were beginning, the particular stars of that particular sky in that particular part of Texas, improbable and absolute and magnificent. "I meant you," he said. "Obviously." "Obviously," she agreed, and leaned her head against his shoulder gently, so as not to wake Catherine, and he put his free arm around her, and they sat in the gathering dark of an April evening in 1888 in a town called Redemption, in a house they had built, and a life they had chosen. And the ordinary evening continued to turn around them, and everything was resolved and real and whole. The hard things did not disappear. The Laredo incident remained in the public record where it belonged. Daniel carried scars from his 3 months in a cell that showed in quiet ways he was learning to manage with Rose's steady help beside him. The injustices of the frontier continued around them in ways that John could address in small, practical ways but could not solve alone. The world was large and complicated and not always kind. But this was home. These were their people. This was the life they had built from a carpetbag and a betrayal and a confession that had cost everything and given back something larger than anything either of them had known to want. And on the North Ridge north of Redemption on summer nights, you could still see the stars with the same startling completeness that had been there before either of them arrived and would be there long after. The same vast and indifferent sky that had witnessed, among its infinite other witnessings, a gruff man with gray eyes who had been afraid for too long, and a fierce woman who had never stopped fighting, and the improbable love that had grown up in the space between those two things. Quiet and complicated and exactly right. Thomas Sullivan, aged 5, had already informed his father that when he grew up he was going to be sheriff. John had said, with the gravity the subject deserved, that this was a fine ambition, and that the most important thing a sheriff needed to be was honest, and that honesty was sometimes more difficult than it sounded, but that it was always worth it. Thomas had thought about this for a moment, and then asked if he could also have a horse. John had said yes. Ellen had listened to this exchange from the kitchen doorway with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and a feeling in her chest that she recognized by now as the particular form of happiness that does not announce itself loudly, but is present in every detail of an ordinary morning: the light through the east window, the smell of the coffee, the sound of her son's determined questions, the sound of her husband's voice answering them with all the patience and honesty he had learned, over years and at considerable cost. To give freely, she had come to Redemption with a carpetbag and a case to fight. She had found a great deal more than justice. She had found a home. She had found a man who had made a terrible mistake and then made the harder and more important choice. She had found a life that was hers in every particular, that she had chosen and built and tended, that had given her roots where she had been rootless and belonging where she had been alone. And on the days when she stood at the schoolroom window at the end of the afternoon and watched the light go golden over the desert, she thought about a woman who had ridden a stagecoach 300 miles with nothing but love and stubbornness, and had not imagined, when she stepped off that stage into the Redemption dust, that the most important thing she would find here was not the justice she had come for. It was everything that came after.